G'day, Warbles on a lot here, with Warbles in the Wilderness number 13, and this is called The Pedophile's Blade, and it's the long version of The Pedophile's Blade, so I get to have a bit of a chat before the poem, and I get to have a bit of a long chat after the poem. Now, pedophile's an interesting word. It comes from paidos, which means youth, and philos, which means love, so it means youth lover. Now, why would I write a poem called The Pedophile's Blade? The blade for youth lovers? Well, it's like this. 15 years ago, a 6-year-old said to me, "Why is it that some people think little children are sexy?" Good question, isn't it? And I had to actually beg off. I had to say, look, give me some time to answer that one. It's a tricky one. And I thought, and it occurred to me that in 1935, the top-ranking box office stars that Hollywood could produce were the teenage starlets. They were 16 or 17 years old, and they were marketed not as being sexy because such words weren't said in those days. They were young, sweet, innocent, fresh, naive. And then the next year, 1936, along comes Shirley Temple, 6 years old, younger, sweeter, more naive, fresher, more innocent. And behold, Shirley Temple with very short skirts and bobby socks and absolutely no hair at all on her legs. She was top of the box office, and Hollywood's response was to commence shaving the starlet's legs so that they could try and compete with the 6-year-old to be younger, sweeter, fresher, more innocent, more naive. And the trouble is, they were all synonyms, code words for sexy. So Hollywood began pumping out the idea that sexy women have no hair on their legs. And the audience role modelled. And as close-up lenses and colour film and nylon stockings became more prevalent, by World War II, all the women were shaving their legs in order to look younger, sweeter, fresher, more innocent. Hollywood had trained the women to compete with the 6-year-olds. So I tried to explain that to the 6-year-old kid, and I did a reasonable job of it without, going into too much detail. But the ideas kept floating around in my mind, and therefore, thus and because, I wrote a poem about it, which I will now stand up and recite for you. The Pedophile's Blade. With her razor in her hand, the woman sits there in the bath. She's been brainwashed by her culture and set firmly on this path. She's been taught it's unattractive for hair on legs to grow there free. She believes it's just about as sexy as some flat-faced chimpanzee. And so she scrapes her skin with knives to try and make it smooth and bare. She's been clear felon in her armpits from the day they first grew hair. For she just must attract a mate. 'Tis why she craves this modification, and seems it matters not the facts of life while chasing beautification. For the only natural female humans, with bald legs and underarms, truth to tell, is them so chronically underage, they's bald in underpants as well. So there she shaves herself for pleasure, thinks how she'll feel so young and sweet, as bald and sexy as them 6-year-olds, with whom she feels she must compete. The pedophile's blade, the lady's razor. Throw it in the bin next time you see one, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, because when all the women in the world train the men in their lives to understand that bald women are not old enough to think lusty thoughts about, that's when all the little children have a chance of being safe. Right? The pedophile's blade. And of course, it's not just the G-rated Hollywood industry that's been conditioning society. There's also the pornography industry. Now, 40 years ago when I was a kid, it was normal for pornography to be kept under the counter and sold in brown paper bags. And if a young fella like myself got a hold of it, the idea of a full frontal nudity shot was absolutely wild and amazing. And there was a category of porn in those days that was called beaver, because not only did it show a woman full frontal, but you could actually see the pubic hair. And all women had pubic hair in the pornography back in those days. Moving on to, say, 25 years ago, things were liberalised, the times they were a-changing, and pornography not only had beaver, there was what was called split beaver, and later on there was split wet beaver. Pretty horrible names, but that's what sort of an industry it is. By the time my son was buying pornography, there was no pubic hair in any of the magazines. He grew up looking at pornography, you know, as a teenager. All the pornography was bald pudenda, naked vaginas, no pubic hair at all. And the industry was trying to condition him to think that the ideal sexy partner was pretty much a 6-year-old with big tits. And I found that pretty objectionable, so I explained things to him about the way life really is. One of the things I explained to him is that there's been a biological imperative for men to go chasing young women for centuries, thousands of years. The whole idea is that youth is emphasised due to its health aspects. Young women are more likely to be able to survive pregnancy than older women. There's also the aspect that old women lay manky eggs. You know, like at 40 years old, 10% of a woman's pregnancies are going to have Down syndrome if they are live births. And that rate goes up by 10% per year until by age 50 the eggs are just not worth hatching. Similarly, men over the age of 40 make bad sperms. Their offspring have 6 times the autistic rate of men under 40. Okay, so there's a general biological emphasis on youth. There's also a bit of a cultural phenomenon which is not often spoken about publicly, but a lot of men understand that women, between the day they voluntarily bestow their virginity on somebody and the day they realise that their period is late, are fairly entirely uninhibited in bed. They don't have a watchdog program at the back of their mind saying, what if I get pregnant? What if I get pregnant? So a lot of men understand that young women may be more exciting in the bedroom. A lot of men also have the idea that the younger a woman is, the less likely she is to be able to see through his bullshit. So I actually spoke with a bloke who was 35 years old or so, and he admitted that by the time they're 19, they're too smart to be any use to him because they can see through his lies. All of which has kind of conspired to mean that your average seductionist root rat style of a bloke is quite likely to be target fixated on young women. And of course the women in the world have noticed this, and I've personally observed what I call the painted secretary competition, which is conducted by the women who work in the main street, and apparently, judging by the makeup and the hairstyles and the clothes and the deportment, the winner of the painted secretary competition is the one who can manage to look the closest to appearing to be an ovulating, nymphomaniac 16-year-old virgin, because that's kind of the legal limit that the adult women think they're allowed to try and look like in order to snare their man or to hold their man. Right, and now we start to get into a few other biological factors, not the least of which is that humans are reaching puberty at younger and younger ages. For the past 150 years or so, people have been getting taller as they get better nutrition, and also they've been hitting puberty at younger age groups. And this means that younger and younger children appear to have a sexually mature body. However, as the neurologists have pointed out, their brains are not fully matured until they're 25, and the lobby against roadkill are trying to have restrictions placed on young people driving on the grounds that their brains are not mature enough to drive a car. So if their brains are not mature enough to drive a car, why would they be considered mature enough to drive a penis or a vagina? Interesting thought, isn't it? Another slightly more obscure biological phenomenon is that if a young girl can smell her biological father in the household, she's going to hit puberty around 2 years later than if she smells a stepfather. Basically, instead of menstruating at 13 or 14. If there's a stepfather in the house, not the biological father, she's going to start menstruating around 9 to 11. And instead of having fertile eggs at 16 to 18, she's going to be running fertile eggs at 13 or 14. And apparently, if a girl's mother changes partners, then the girl's best strategy is to hit puberty early, get out of the house and start her own household. Now, one of the reasons for this is that women are attracted by the pheromones of a man with a different immunotype. So whereas the girl will not be sexually attracted by her father or her biological brother, she may well be attracted by the pheromones of a stepfather or a stepbrother. Interesting. So we have a kind of a causal link between the contraceptive pill, the increase in marriage breakdown, the Brady bunches and the rising number of girls hitting puberty at an earlier and earlier age, while in an environment where they're surrounded by men they're not closely biologically related to. Bit of a bad recipe. In fact, it seems a recipe for people to be sexualised at an ever earlier age, and one of the things that happens when individuals are sexualised at an early age is that they may become kind of frozen on that point. So somebody whose sexuality switched on at 14 may become forever attracted to 14-year-olds, or somebody whose sexuality is switched on by somebody who's 20, 25, 30 years older than them, they may become forever attracted to partners who are that much older than them. It's an interesting game. There are lots of imprinting effects going on. I've heard quite a few imprisoned pedophiles interviewed on Radio National, and one fellow there, when he was 10 years old, he watched his father murder his mother in an argument over drunken adultery, and he became forever after attracted to 10-year-old boys because he was a 10-year-old boy when his childhood ended. Now, as to what happens to these children who are abused, well, 7% of the abused children, sexually abused children, grow up to become child sex abusers. However, 50 to 85% of abusers were themselves abused, and the difference in the statistics is that 50% were sexually abused and 35% were abused some other savage, traumatic way, like the kid who watched his father kill his mother. Now, according to the Melbourne University School of Medicine, reported in ABC Radio National's news bulletins about 8 consecutive times, on the 14th of February 2010, survivors of child sexual assault have 18 times the death by suicide rate and 48 times the accidental drug overdose rate, which, to my pathetic mathematical mind, means they may be 95% of suicides and 98% of the accidental overdose rates, overdose death rates. Now, the overdose deaths seem to indicate that they're chasing pain relief, and I think that's due to their feelings of shame and worthlessness and hopelessness, which are engendered due to having felt that their only use, their only good, is to satisfy somebody else's sexual desires, because that's what's happened to them. By comparison to that 18 times the normal suicide death rate, the children of combat veterans only have 3 times the normal suicide death rate, and combat veterans themselves only have twice the normal suicide death rate. So being sexually assaulted as a kid, it's 6 times worse than being a combat veteran's child, and it's 9 times worse than being a combat veteran. It's one of the worst suicide generators I know of. It seems to me that the advocates of lowering the age of consent are men in their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s who want to fantasise that somewhere there's going to be a pubescent teenage girl who's going to be willing to have sex with them if only it were legal. And I got to say, I find that transparent and disgusting, and even from a gynecological point of view, you know, like vaginal mucosal membrane is not robust enough to cope with having penetrative sex until the end of puberty. It's not how old a girl is when she has a first period that counts. Wake up, you silly bastards. Children are children. And it's a really stupid idea to try and exercise somebody else's reproductive organs unless you would be prepared to assist them to raise the child which you may conceive and reproduce. So, that's the long-run version, analysed, of the pedophile's blade. And I may be a mad scientist and I may be a fool on the hill, but if the fool on the hill was not an important position, the Beatles would never have sung about it. Ciao.